A leather belt in its simplest form is really just a strap of leather with a buckle on it, some holes punched in it. It's not a very complicated thing to make. Very good beginner's project for leather workers. I'm going to make this one a little bit more complex than the basic simple strap because I'm going to be using 2 pieces of leather for each belt. I'm actually going to be making 2 belts, one black and one brown. These are going to be a women's dress belt, so they're going to be pretty plain in a lot of ways. Only 3/4 of an inch wide. I've got this other strip that's cut wider than that because this is going to be my lining leather. I'm starting off with, these strips are about 5 ounces of leather, 5 to 6 ounce leather. And these are about 3 to 4. So basically I'm going to have about 8 to 9 ounce of leather total once I've got the 2 strips together. And that's a pretty good number for a lot of belts. Sometimes that's almost too thick for dress belts because dress pants don't always have loops that are made for thicker or wider belts. So that's also why it's 3/4 of an inch wide, is because especially on women's clothing, they don't really usually always have very good belt loops. Now for men that are just wearing blue jeans, a lot of times that'll be an 1.5 inch wide belt and you can make it almost as thick as you want and it'll just work just fine. Some of the belts I've done for people for concealed carry have been almost 1/4 inch thick, which would be about 16 ounces of leather. It just really depends on the person and the belt and how stiff they want it to be, how thick they want it to be, what will fit in their belt loops. There's no magic number for belts as to what thicknesses make it. But on a generic belt, I would say probably 8 to 9 ounce total. On a heavier belt for like a work belt or something like that, 10 to 11 ounces. But anyway, we get started on this belt, or these belts I should say. So as I said, this is a strap of, it was a little bit thicker, but it's about 5 ounce now. I've split it to the thickness it needed to be. And I'm going to use this little template that I've got, which of course is clear, so it doesn't show very well on videos. I got this from Springfield Leather Company, and before I had this, I used a similar sort of template, but it's one I just made up myself out of pieces of leather that I'd cut to size and shape. But pretty much it has the holes marked on it, and the slot for the belt buckle. And then you could start on this end, and you have where your tip's going to be, and a piece that's going to be what you have that you don't want to punch holes in for the end of it, and then where your sizing holes are going to be. So it makes it all really easy to lay out and mark. It's clear so you can see through it. It doesn't work as well on 3/4 inch like this because it's actually got these widths built into it for inch, 1.25 inch, and 1.5 inch belts. But I can, since I can see through it, I can line it up well enough to get everything centered up and marked. So on that side, I just need the end, the slot, and where the holes are going to be for. You can use rivets or snaps, or you can stitch it together, whatever you want to do to put that in. Having some of the right tools helps too. Like this is for punching out that slot, and it can go right through. In just a couple hits. Otherwise you have to punch 2 holes and cut between them. The same with what you're going to be using for your snaps or rivets or screw posts or whatever. I'm going to be using snaps in this case. And for that, I always have to think about where I want to put which ones. I'm going to use the Segma style snaps. I actually have 2 different size holes. One side goes in 1/8 inch holes and the other side goes in, what's the number 4 hole? It's not a 3/16, I don't think. It might be a 3/16. And then we can just cut this off. I'll round it out a little bit more than that template had, just because it's not really made for 3/4. So that's one side of our belt. Now normally when you're making a belt, and if you're making out of just one solid strap of leather, you want to take this end and from just behind these holes, skive it down a little bit thinner. But since I'm going to be lining it, I don't have to do that, because I'm just going to have my lining come up to here and stop. This part's going to be unlined, and so it'll fold over and still be where there's not too much of a big huge bump right here once it's all snapped together. So as I said, this end's basically cut out. After that, I'll grab my big, I've got a 48-inch long measuring stick that I use, and I'll cut it off to the length that it needs to be for this person's belt. Don't ever just go with, if somebody says, oh, I wear this size pants, and try to make the belt that size, because it's probably not going to be accurate. I've had it be off at least about 3 inches before from what they say their pant size is. So try to get a measurement from an actual belt that belonged to them, or actually measure their waist. I carry around in my pocket, and it's probably popped up on the channel a couple times, a tailor's tape, and it comes in handy a lot. I use it for a bunch of things besides just leather work. As you can see, it's been bouncing around my pocket so long, it started to wear off. So it's about time to get a new one of those. But that's just a very handy thing to have if somebody's asking you to make a belt, is just, okay, here, let's measure your waist. And then you can actually make it the right size the first time, rather than have to try to do it again. Now this side's kind of the same way. Alternately on this, you can, instead of marking each of those holes, you can just lay it out by punching one, and actually usually I will start in the middle, and then I go a finger's width apart, and basically just what the punch fits, just kind of go right down next to it, and that's usually about right. It's also easier to line these up straight if you turn it and you're looking down the strap. So then you can actually make sure you're centered up on it a little bit easier. You can see that they're in line. Alright, now I didn't use the end of this, but it can mark out a regular English strap point on the end of a belt, but it really works best on an 1.5-inch belt. It kind of looks alright on 1.25 inches, or when you get down to 1 inch, sort of, but sort of looks flattened off. So instead of using that end, I've actually got another little plastic template that I got from Tandy that has all the different strap ends on it. That's really a handy one. I've got one of these that they're just rounded too, that I use quite a bit. Again, something that I had kind of homemade versions of before, but now I have found plastic ones that are pre-made, so I use those. And then I don't have, I had these on like a key ring where I had leather pieces, and I had like 8 or 9 of them cut out of different sizes, and they were just like on a key ring, and I just lay them out on leather whenever I needed them. This is handy because I've got, well, let's see, we got 8 of them here that are all different sizes, from a 1/2 inch up to 2 inches. And they're all just right on this one little plastic template. Alright, so there's the outside piece of the belt. Now, since we are going to be lining this one, I've got a few more steps to do. First and foremost, piece of the lining leather. The end that's going to be up where the buckle is, I'm just going to cut off straight. I'm kind of getting rid of that very end of it that had some stretchy stuff on it. And I'm going to skive it. There it goes down to nothing. So I don't have a lump there to deal with. And I'm just going to measure that up with my belt blank that I've got cut out here. Like I said, I want to go just shy of these holes and fit there. And I don't have to get it precise. I want to leave extra because you can see it's wider than the belt, so once I've got it glued and stitched together, I can come back and trim it off. And I'm going to give it a couple extra inches just to be sure. Won't even get the round knife out for that. It doesn't even need to be straight. Just trim it off. Alright. Before we do any dyeing and finishing, it's the usual steps of, I'm going to bevel the edges on this top piece. I'm not going to bother with the bottom one yet because I will have to trim it off. And I'm going to put a stitching groove around the edge of it because since I'm lining it, I want to stitch all the way around. Now, if you're hand stitching, that's a lot of work to hand stitch a belt. You might want to just go with a single basic strap. If you have a machine like I do, then it's not a lot of work. It's just a couple more minutes, and it makes a lot more nicer finished product to line it. So it's worthwhile. Let's move this in just a bit. Individually. But next step will be doing all that same stuff to another strap to make the second belt. Because this one's pretty much ready to be dyed and put together. Now normally on belts and straps I like to use sheep wool scraps to spread the dye because you can just lay the strap through it and run it back and forth and cover it real quick. But since one of these has to be black and one of them has to be brown, and that can make a lot of mess, I decided I'm just going to use daubers in this case. I'm going to start with the brown one because I don't want to get black all over the place and then have a chance of staining it. If I get some brown on the black one, it won't matter. I'll just be able to dye over it. So to start with, I'm using some walnut oil dye. Another little trick is I always tape a piece of pipe to the side of the container that I can store the daubers in. And I just use the same dauber again and again for the same color. Now I'm not going to dye the lining pieces. I'll leave those natural so that the belt doesn't accidentally stain clothing or something. So I don't have to be really careful with how I dye the edges, because it's going to be a separate piece added on later. So I don't have to worry about getting dye any place I don't want it to be. So the easiest way is really just to kind of coil the belt up like this. Alright, that's going to need a few minutes to dry. And the same thing with the black belt, only just with black oil dye. I already have some scrap pieces that I don't have to dye. They're already black and brown, so I'm going to use those for keeper loops. But you could just take a scrap piece of the same leather that you just cut off for the belt and make a keeper loop out of it. Keeper loop is the part that goes right behind the belt buckle to keep that extra end that goes through the buckle from flapping around. And they could be metal pieces, or in this case leather pieces, since I don't have any of the metal ones laying around that I think will look good with the buckles I have. All I have are simple strap keepers that are for harness work and things like that. Now I cut these scrap pieces, they're a little more than 3/8, a little less than a half. It depends on your belt that you're making. For again, a men's belt that's 1.5 inches wide, a 1/2 inch wide keeper loop looks good. For a women's belt that's a lot narrower, that's only 3/4 inch wide, it looks really wide and clunky compared to the belt. And just to add a little bit of something to them, I'm also going to take, and I've got these wet right now, and I'm just going to use a wing divider to put a crease in them on either side. It'll be a lot easier to see in the brown one. Now, since this was scrap and I know it was down off the belly of the hide, it's got a little bit of stretch to it and some soft spots. So that's partially why I cut as long of a piece out of this one, is because I wanted to look for the spots that, like, this is a soft spot, that's not going to work well. So I figured if I cut a long enough piece, I would come up with a piece that I could make a good keeper out of. And a keeper loop just needs to be big enough to go around the width of belt you've got, and a couple layers of it. And in this case, I'm going to give it a little extra room because I've also still got that liner. We can cut it there. And get rid of some of this. Let's just use the shears. Get rid of some of that soft spot. Like I said, I'll give it a little bit of extra room, but not a lot. Cut it there. And I'll do the same thing. I'll just trim off the black one, which was a stiffer piece of leather, and I didn't have to worry as much about it. And you can stitch these together. There's a lot of different ways you can put them together. I like to give them just a little bit of a burnish on that edge before I stick it together, Technically this leather is already finished. It's dyed and finished to start with, so I don't have to worry too much about that. But if I was going from a blank piece of leather, I would have had to have started with, when I was dyeing the belt, also dyeing these. But I'm just going to put them together with a stapler that I have here. It's a really old, it uses wide staples that are hard to find. Plier type stapler. And I usually put 2 staples in each of them. I have also stitched these before. It's a little tricky. You got to kind of like twist them a little bit to get the needle to come out. Otherwise it just goes through and hits the other side, especially on small ones like this, or even worse on ones for watch bands, which are really tiny. But yeah, there's 2 3/4 inch keepers. Now that everything has a chance for the dye to dry, I'm going to go ahead and put a clear finish on these. And I'm going to start with the pieces that are natural in color and work my way up to the darker. So I'll do these natural ones first, and then the brown, and then the black. Just in case I pick up some dye, I don't want to spread it onto this natural colored leather, because I'm planning on leaving this natural on the back side of the belt. And these keepers are technically already finished, but I'm going to give them a coat of this anyway, just so their sheen sort of matches. And the reason I did the black one last is you can see that I did manage to pick up some dye on the sheeple scraps, just enough to stain things a little bit. It's kind of a grayish color. So there's a trick, is to always dye from lightest to darkest, or to finish from lightest to darkest if you're going to be finishing different colors, because you could pick up some of that dye and you don't want to spread it. Now if I was making these just a simple leather strap belt, 1 layer, I pretty much just have to set some snaps and finish the edges, and these would be done. Just pop them together. But since I'm lining these, I still have to go through the next step of gluing the liner on and then taking it down to my machine and stitching it before I can do those steps. So that's where we're at now, is I'm going to go ahead and get this glued up. Putting these together is pretty simple. It's just a matter of sort of lining up where we want this skived edge to be and paying attention to it. And then you can just stick the belt on. Kind of try and stay down the middle of this strap, but if you wander a little bit, that's usually okay. That's why I leave it about a 1/2 inch wider than the strap I'm planning on putting on it. And this is, now those are both ready to be stitched. I'm probably not going to film that. I'm just going to take these downstairs and run through the machine real quick. Again, like I said, if you're doing a hand stitch belt, this takes a lot of time to stitch all the way around and to line a belt, so it's usually not as much worth it. Might as well just stick to a solid strap and skive this end. But if you've got a machine, this is a great way to finish a belt, to have that nice finished leather on the inside. And the stitching looks nice around the edge too. Alright, now that I've got these sewed, then I can just trim off this excess leather. I'm just going to use a utility knife to do that, and just sort of follow along the edge. Alright, once it's trimmed, then it's taking the edge beveler to the back of it. Dyeing and finishing those edges, setting some snaps. Not much left to do. A little bit of dye, and a little bit of gum tragacanth, and slick these edges. If you leave the back of the belt natural like this, you gotta be kind of careful with the dye, not to overdo it, get it all over the place. There is a trick about using a dauber that's been burnt away so it doesn't have as much fluff to it. I usually don't find it necessary. I just use a lighter touch. Now once you've put some burnishing compound of whatever type you're going to use on these edges, I'm using gum tragacanth, but there's other stuff out there. Could just be wax of some sort. I usually kind of rub it in sort of smoothly, get it nice and even. You can take and just use your regular edge slicker and just work your way all the way around like you would normally do on most projects. It's a lot of time to do that around a belt. They also make tools, wooden tools like this that you can fit in a drill press or on a buffing machine that you can just get it spinning and just sit there and work the belt through. That works really quick. The fastest way I found to do straps, especially longer straps even than these, if you ever do reins or something like that, is to just use a canvas scrap. And you can see this one's been used quite a bit. I keep one that's for colors, one that's for just brown, one that's for just black. And that really actually burnishes it up really nicely. And you can just do this by running back and forth through your hands. And just the friction that's caused by that canvas will buff that edge really nicely. So I still got to do that to the other belt, but we're going to go ahead and finish this one up since the edges are finished. That's the last major step. I still got to punch out these holes because they don't go all the way through. Got to set some snaps, and then put the buckle on. As I mentioned before, I'm using what's called a Segma style snap. It's an older style. I think it's got another name, but I don't remember what it was. Line 16, maybe? I don't remember. They have one advantage for belts, and that is that the pieces come together, the two pieces of leather are going to come together flat. They don't have that gap between them for the piece of the snap, because the snap actually sets down flush into the leather. So that makes them really nice for putting on belts. And they hold pretty well, actually, for small snaps. As a matter of fact, they're really hard to snap the first time you put them together. And they just hold amazingly well for the size that they are. I have seen people that wanted bigger snaps just because they thought bigger was better. In this case, I don't really think it is, because the pieces of leather coming together right next to each other and fitting together flush means that something can't get in between there and really pop them apart. So these are set to have two different size holes. The socket part of it goes into a hole that's a number 4 hole punch. And then there's going to be a setter that looks like a little stud that basically pops into the snap. And same thing on this one. The other side sets kind of like a rivet. You put these posts up through it. They go in the smallest hole in this setter. Then you got the stud part of the snap, and the setter looks like the other side of the snap, the socket. And again, it kind of pops onto the snap, and part of these setters is shaping the snap to fit the other side of it. Matter of fact, the setters almost, they're just a little bit of play. They're real close to each other. But once we have that set, like I said, the first time you try to snap it, it almost can't be done by hand. You pretty much have to get a pair of pliers or something out, or tap it with a mallet. But make sure your snaps are lined up if you do that. You don't want to damage them. But there you can see that there's no gap between the leather when they pop together. So there's nothing that catches in there to get and pops them open. So they hold really, really well. Alright. Where's my keeper loop? So we'll slide the keeper on. Then the belt buckle. In this case, a brass one. We will snap the first snap. Again, hard to snap, as it should be. And then snap the second snap. And that's really all there is to the final assembly. Now I just got to do the same thing with the other belt. Only difference is we're going to use this keeper loop and we're going to use a stainless steel buckle instead of a brass one. Because I think black and stainless, or black and nickel, looks better. And stainless is a better solution than a nickel plated buckle. Now one final step on these that I don't always do on men's belts, but on women's belts, or especially on purse straps, leather balm. It's leather balm with Adam's wax. It's actually a great product for softening up leather. Seems to be, I think, what it's made for. But it's a little bit of a finish too, a little bit of a waxy coating. But like where it really excels is it makes the leather feel softer and more flexible. And on a man's belt, they might not think that much of that. They might think that that actually makes it worse. This stuff will soak in. And like I said, it functions kind of like a wax. So it'll actually make the surface start to look a little hazy after a minute, and you gotta buff it. Make it feel like a nicely broken in belt without all the cracks and signs of wear that a belt has as it breaks in. And to buff it up after that's dried, like I said, it gets kind of a little bit duller appearance. Just use that same canvas scrap that I used to finish the edge. Then you got a softer belt that doesn't creak as much and feels nice in the hand, basically.